So no, we're not done with this guy. Actually, we're not gonna be done with him for a while because he's got some pretty weird videos, and it's not to highlight what he says. It's just because he is a representative of a lot of other people's thoughts.
Okay, I usually do ancient culture studies and things, and I've gone through some studies before.
Well, firstly, you don't do ancient studies, you do racial studies, and you don't even do that well. You don't even do it half as well as you would expect someone to do it. Because you know how easy it is to be biased and say things that are negative about people's races and stuff? That's like one of the easiest jobs ever. That's why there's so many of you guys out there, even black people now, black, Indians, whatever, different races who are like, this is an easy path to money. You just say crazy things and then people pay you for it. But for some reason, you sort of look at yourself as if you do history. Tell me one thing on your channel that's pure history. Doesn't involve black people, doesn't involve doesn't involve black people, really. That's the only criteria that I could put out there.
On slavery and things like that, but lately on my threads that I've had black people just going crazy, black Americans. Really, nobody from the UK. In fact, they defend sometimes, but
If there's anybody from the UK who's black who's defending this guy, please stop. You know, you will realize that as well. I mean, this is the same guy who played that guy before, that Nigerian guy who goes and talks bad stuff about Nigeria, Africa, black people. One of the hobbies that the white people love to do or love to participate in is picking black people who say terrible things and then putting them out there like, look, one of your own is saying this. And then I have to sit there and debate them. Here's a highlight from this guy.
Black men make horrible fathers. Different culture, different parenting style.
Yep, that happened. This person just accused all black people of that, which is ridiculous. Now, I'm not going to react to it anytime soon because, again, I don't want to do the fatigue thing where we listen to the same person over and over again. I did that with that other dude. Remember that dude who I forgot what he calls himself, but he's an FBA guy. And I realized a lot of people got tired of him real fast. But sometimes I want to put people's content out there and show like these people, it's not like a one-off. It's not like I go find someone who made a one-time video where they say something disparaging, because those people, I've gone back sometimes to clarify, like, okay, this girl, she actually doesn't believe that, or this guy, they actually don't believe that, or whatever. I don't like the thing where people find one video of someone and then they destroy the person. It has to be like something that's consistent in order for it to be a problem.
um, going crazy saying that 400 years of slavery is about up and all these things. And I thought slavery was over in 1865, but this guy, Dontel Jackson, right?
By the way, tell me if I'm lying. This time, this guy sounds clear and he sounds like everything he's saying is coming out better. I think this guy somewhat is a better talker than me. And you can hear in the way that he's talking that it's no longer the slurriness of last time. A lot of the stuff that he's saying is starting to come together as a sentence. He's still full of nonsense, but
Here, praise him for coming out and forward with this, because what he actually did was drop the racism.
when a person like this praises a black man, you know that black man has done something wrong.
uh, that he had been instilled with as a young child. And that book, the Bible, that instilled the racism in him. And he decided to look in other books and see if he couldn't find the truth to the slave trade. And if it led him to white people, he'd probably have an article about white people, or he'd just have hatred. But you can
So you're basically starting to get the picture. This is that black and Jewish people are the slavers and white people did nothing. One of those type of videos.
see an enlightened smile upon his face because he figured something out. And I get that look in myself whenever I find out things from the Bible and I catch something that proves that here's another attachment to Roman and Greek things and stuff like that. So, because
Damn. Usually talk so negatively about black people, but this guy all of a sudden is like talking about him like he's the king of kings or something. By the way, I find it funny that he's like, "Oh, when I do research for history, I go into the Bible." Really? That's your first stop?
Not to spoil it, the Bible's written by Greek people, and the New Testament was written by Romans and Greeks to deify. Now, let's see. If you look up Flavian signature, it'll show you about the New Testament. If you look up the big elephant in the Bible, it'll show you about the Old Testament. But there's a lot of stuff that they break down in the Old Testament. But needless to say, any of those will pretty much show you that it's been false, doctrinated, twisted, pulled together by other people's stuff, and it really has no bearing on anything. And so,
Well, isn't that great? He believes in the Bible, but he believes that the Old Testament is fake because it's twisted and pulled. I'll give you 3 chances to guess why he thinks the Old Testament is fake. The clue is he says that the New Testament is written by Greeks and Romans, which it was not. It was written by Judeo people, it was written by Jews, and they spoke Greek, but they were Jews. The only person who some scholars argue was not Jewish, well, not the only, but one of the few people who they argue was not Jewish is Luke. That's one person.
some 400 years that the Egyptians were supposed to have gotten the Hebrews back for, but then they didn't even want them or whatever that they talk about.
So I want to state that this is not an attempt to upset anybody who's religious, but there is no proof that Jewish people were slaves in Egypt at all. Not for 400 years, not for 7,000 years, not for a day. There's no evidence that there were slaves. Is there evidence there were Jewish people? Yes, but most of the evidence of Jewish people in Egypt, ancient Egypt, comes from them escaping a lot of places. It's only under Roman Egypt that the Jews start getting attacked, but there's nothing about being Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, that would make them attack the idea or attack the concept of being Jewish. Like there's nothing about being Jewish that's bad that would make them do that. A lot of the stories that are written about Jews getting, or let's say Israelites, because that's Jews is a very specific word. The only word that we have of Israelites getting attacked by Egyptians is a straight up war that happened between the two of them. But we'll talk about that another day.
Has actually happened in Scripture and didn't happen here in America. I believe we were only enslaving people for 89 years. It was
So, of course, he's just going to make up a number 89 years. We know that it's been about 400 years in America where they enslave the people. It's been 400 years of enslavement. Obviously, there's a difference between what happened in South America and North America. And so we need to make sure we separate those two a little bit. They're both slavery, they're both part of the transatlantic slave trade. But
1776 when we became America. Before that, we were British Columbia and or New England. So really weren't here. In fact, it was English people coming over here. But then,
oh, I see. So the way that he's trying to do this, which I did think about earlier, but I thought that would be so ridiculous. He's going to say because the people changed their name, therefore it's not the same exact people who did it before. No, it's the same. It's the same group. It's the same group. Don't worry about it.
we turned on them, took the country from them, which deserved because of what they had done through the white people through the Dark Ages, which lasted about 1,300 years. And constant chattel slavery through the whole thing. All the white people were basically slaves. You know, you think, oh, that was a time of kings. Yeah, well, the king was a king and everybody else was enslaved, and there was feudalism.
This guy's really trying to spread the word slave to its biggest limit. The people in England were not all slaves, not especially not people who were right below the king, especially those who could also tell the king what to do, like the council.
and it kept people from being able to advance. I mean, if you're a barber, and you're always a barber, and you couldn't go anywhere with it. And if you did anything wrong or got out of hand, they would just skin you alive and kill you.
Yeah, Europe kind of sucked back then. Now, if only you guys didn't take your sucky attitude and bring it to the rest of the world, then we would have appreciated that.
With a bunch of torture devices that they created too. So it's a whole lot different than the slave trade, where they actually tried to keep them real healthy because they had paid a lot of money for a guy that was going to help them as a worker to build a farm. But
So let's get rid of the myths real quick. Did they torture the people? Absolutely. And they tortured them right until the very last minute of slavery. There are some people, there are actually audio tapes that you can listen to of slaves talking about themselves getting burned by hot rods and stuff like that. They're actually on YouTube. Just go on YouTube and type words of slaves that were recorded by the government. Here's the second thing. The second thing is the people of England did not have it worse than the slaves. A lot of them were free. And just like today, obviously, if you do a certain job, you're going to stay in that job for a pretty long time. Very rarely in our modern world do people just skip job from job to job to job. A lot of people are kind of trapped in whatever they do. I mean, today less so because there's so many other opportunities. You can go in all kinds of directions.
I digress. Let's read this here real quick, and I'm not going to go through all of it. What I am going to do is pause with each little area so you can read it yourself, and if you'll pause the video in those times, you can read it too. But very enlightening and stuff.
Which means we have to give a separate intro, which is what's probably on here is probably going to be nonsense. He probably agrees with it because it's going to attack certain groups that he doesn't like, perhaps Jewish people and then black people. I get the whole like people want to hate Jewish people and blah blah blah, but I don't get why they actually don't do the research. If you want to find real reasons, then you go look at it for real in history. But I don't understand why you have to make stuff up.
Hello, and welcome to my website. We thought that we were white. I'm sorry, we thought that they were white. My name is Dontel Jackson, and like many African Americans, I was brought up in a culture deeply infused with propaganda designed to lay the blame for all black racist ills on the white man.
Um, so before he was correct, all the racist stuff was laid on the white man, especially if we expand the word white to mean white, like Asiatic as well, like Middle Eastern people. But let's do the trans-Saharan slave trade. That one can be laid 100% at the foot of white people, and they brag about it. They don't just talk about it, they brag about it. They're like, yeah, we got this many slaves from this area, and these ones are easy to get, and these ones this and that and that and that and that. What's that old saying? A great claim needs great evidence, something like that. You need to make sure you have a lot of evidence if you're going to try to convince someone like me that it's all the Jewish people's fault.
It was not until I began looking into the actual histories of black, whites, and other races in America that I came to realize that many, if not most, of the resentment that African Americans harbor regarding our long history of abuse and exploitation has been intentionally misdirected by those who are responsible for it to shift the blame away from themselves as a people and onto the white race who they regard as their enemies.
Okay, so now we're in Kookyville. Apparently, Jewish people see the white race as their enemies. When did that happen?
Well, that catches my eye there. Let's see what he's found here with this because, wow, okay. The reality is the white race had little to do with the slave trade that took our ancestors away from Africa and sold them into bondage in the New World. That crime was committed not by white Europeans, but by Jews who were engaged in transatlantic commerce between the Old World and the Americas, where they hoped to establish a new Jerusalem from which they rule the world by way of exploiting all races who were not members of the tribe of the chosen people. In their efforts to accomplish that goal, the white race has been hoodwinked and manipulated as unsuspecting pawns almost as much as the black race has been. Well,
So there's two places that I want him to mention in order to prove this. One is Sao Tome, and the other one is Principe. If he doesn't mention any of these, then what he's saying doesn't make any sense. I want him to tell me why these Portuguese ports were ruled by Jewish people. If he can prove that they were ruled by Jewish people, then maybe he's onto something. Also, I want him to prove in Luanda, which is different than Loango, which is near Gabon. Luanda, a slaver's bay that carried some of the biggest amount of Portuguese slaves to the Americas. I want you to prove to me that that one was also run by Jewish people. If you can't do it, then no. And also, you can't just say, oh, we think that they're Jewish. That doesn't count. And then two, you can't say that they happen to be Jewish. Like, you must show that they have this thing in mind of trying to create a new Jerusalem. Once all those are fulfilled, then I can accept what you're saying.
Well, that's weird. Okay, so every time that I read stuff, whenever I'm going through, I get things out of it, and I get something out of this right here. I've heard of the New Jerusalem that they were trying to set up over here, but it just kind of faded away. Or did it? Or did it just melt in and you don't notice it?
Well, that's not a good start. Already starting with a conspiracy theory. Apparently, America is Jerusalem. It's the new Jerusalem.
You know, because Jews don't look too much different than white people, so you just have no idea. Unless they have a real Jewy name, you're not going to have any idea.
Okay, so that's flaw number 2. Jews do not look like European white people, the original Jews. The Jews that had existed in the later periods who were also Middle Eastern. So let's take the ones like that of Maimonides and further. So let's say 1100 to about today, right? Most of those would have looked something like Middle Eastern people. Maimonides looked like a Middle Eastern person, even though he was from Europe. That's why he fits in so well with the Arabs. So, and then you have the Jews that were in Nigeria that were kicked out by the Moroccans. You have the Jews that were in Morocco that were kicked out by the other groups, the Arab groups. None of them report them being white people. The Jews that he's talking about that look like white people are Ashkenazi Jews. And the amount of work they did really has nothing to do with the early years of the American continent.
And so it's all dumped on white people, but yet that's odd because, you know, we've done our family tree back, and apparently when we came over, just like thousands and thousands and thousands of white people that came over, we were in chattel slavery too. And so were the African Americans, where
Okay, so is he saying that the Jews basically enslaved black people and white people and sent them to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade? That would be funny. By the way, if you look at any real credible source, they will tell you that there might have been some Jews involved, but they would have been minuscule in number. We're talking about tens of people versus the thousands of white people involved in slavery. And I know you're going to be like, thousands? How many slave owners were there? The owners are the ones in America. There's still the people who transport, the people who grab them, the people who take care of them, whip them, all that other stuff.
it was 7 years that you worked and then you were released. But in general, you had no place to go.
So what he's talking about here is indentured servitude, where you have to work for a while, and then what you get after those 7 years, basically you're not getting paid until the end of all of that. And a lot of that pay at the end is going to be taken away from nursing you. So some people do call that slavery, and to some degree it is slavery. The problem is not everyone who went to the Americas, especially not everyone in general, was in indentured servitude. Most people actually were, you know, day pay laborers. You do the job, you get paid. You do the job, you get paid.
you would get a little plot of land that you would work another 7 to 14 years to make. And my great 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 grandfather had made some pact like that, and my great great grandfather ended up at getting a house built that had a dirt floor, and my great grandfather ended up taking over that house. My grandfather was born in that house, and he got built up enough to where he didn't have a dirt floor anymore on his house.
Now, I'm not saying he's a liar, but the only reason why this is probable that this happened is because this did happen in the past, where this would happen, but and it happened more and more closer to the end, where indentured servitude would be like this. Now, indentured servitude happened everywhere around the world in different ways. The difference between indentured servitude and slavery is that the beating the crap out of somebody part, the torture part, that part, the indentured servitude, a lot of it, you're just a servant.
And so on, and built up from there. And of course, the Depression hit right in the middle of that one right there, too. But regardless of that, let's go on. Blacks have been purposely misled by the Jewish people, who in previous centuries built their fortunes in transatlantic slave trade, and who continue to manipulate and exploit us even today.
Okay, go on. I want to hear this. I'm not even gonna contradict it so far. I just want to hear where they think they're going with this, because I hear a lot of black people actually say this, like, no, it wasn't the white people, it was the Jews. See, yeah. But I was gonna say, there is something kind of funny about it. The person saying it wasn't the white people. If you said it was also the Jews, that would be a different situation. But when you say it's not the white people, that's where I'm like,
Really? Because most black people make no distinction between Jews and whites, it's easy for the Jews to evade justice and escape the blame for the wrongs that they have inflicted on our people.
maybe most black people in America don't make a separation. In Africa, they do. 100% they do. In Africa, there's a difference between different types of white people. Like, we don't all put them in the same. There's a difference in Afrikaans. There's a difference between an English white person. There's a difference between a Jewish white person. There's a difference between a German Jew. There's a difference between a German white person. All of those are not all in the same basket because they don't all pose necessarily the same risk.
For centuries by convincing blacks that it was the white man who did it. Well, yeah, I mean, we never had slaves and everything off of it. One of the things that I looked into.
So I know the Dutch had slaves. I know that the British had slaves. I know that the Portuguese had slaves. I know that basically you can pick a country in Western Europe and then you can say, yeah, they had slaves. But I want to see how he's going to tie that to mean Jewish.
Said that only 25% of the people in America ever owned slaves at all, and that 92% of those were in the South, and it was because of the plantations.
So again, important point, the slave trade wasn't just done by slave owners. Those aren't the only criminals. You have the people selling them, you have the people breeding them, you have the people chasing them, you have the people torturing them. Or it's not just slave owners that are the problem. Now, of course, 25% is a large population. Take 25% of America right now. Imagine if those people all own slaves. 25% of the population right now. Is he claiming that 25% of the population in America was all Jewish? Because that's one hell of a claim.
And because people up north would have servants and things in small plantations and plots. I mean, Washington, Jefferson, and these guys did not have giant plantations necessarily. I mean, what they had was big compared to anybody else's stuff. Anyhow.
Oh yeah, this guy just reminded me. Not only was the white people doing slavery back then, but there also were other groups of people like Native Americans and people like that who did slavery. I actually remember an episode, I think it was with Don Cheadle, who they said that Native Americans had his ancestors do slavery, and James Gates was actually laughing about it. But I think he should have first explained that, being under Native American slavery is very different than being under the white people, unless, of course, they've just adopted the same system. For example, there's that Iroquois guy, or no, he's a Mohawk guy. He was bought from Europeans to join the Mohawk tribe as a slave. And by the end of his life, when he's like in his 40s, he was the chief of the Mohawk. Very different. That would never happen in the white areas. So the type of slavery that they were doing in the Indian areas is very different. And so again, I want you to prove to me why this one is the Jewish one.
In most cases, the vast majority of the white race had nothing to do with slavery or other crimes that are committed against our people. Whites were and continue to be exploited and manipulated by the Jews.
Okay, a lot of talking. Little proof, but a lot of talking. So anyone who's watched this channel knows that the Europeans came in hot. The Portuguese were calling Nubians ugly. They were obsessed with violence and spreading their religion and all this other stuff. So I want to see again, when does this narrative start to take shape? Because so far all I've been hearing is accusation after accusation.
Same as blacks, and their race is even more hated by the Jew. Yeah, they don't like whites. Where blacks are simply disregarded by the Jews as indifference, they call them goyim, as
So I'm very familiar with this word goyim, and the word goyim is non-racial. The word goyim really means other nations outside of the Jewish nation, which includes other Israelites. By the way, someone might say, hey, why don't we go further back than that? Okay, well, the word goy really means nation, including the Jewish nation.
are other races. Yeah, they're all goyim. We are simply pawns to the Jews who have no other use for us beyond a source of profit to them and a weapon that can be used to help destroy whites.
So I don't actually get it. If the word goyim means anybody outside of their nation, why would they focus so heavily on whites? And also, why would they enslave the blacks and trick the whites? Like, what does that mean?
Oh, how are they going to do that? Well, who they see as their sworn enemies by encouraging us to breed with them until there are no longer any whites left.
So basically, what they're talking about now is the great replacement theory. And the big flaw in, well, there's two flaws. Let's start with the first one. One, this is going to take an extraordinary long time before you can breed so much that there's no white people. Also, if you've ever been to anywhere where a lot of people have bred before, South America, you can easily see that people who are black don't just dominate and that's it. You can still get white people in those regions. And then here's the second problem with it, and this is the worst one. Jewish people are mixed themselves. There's like Ethiopian Jews, there's Yemenite Jews, there's Spanish Jews, there's German Jews. All of them are mixed. So how is getting you mixed going to make your group disappear? It didn't make them disappear. If you take every population right now that claims to be Jewish, you can't even find me one that's not mixed with anything. If you go pick any, I challenge y'all to find me one group of Jewish people who can just say we are just Jewish, we just come from Israel.
Oh yeah, you see that and an edict thing that's come out, so that that kind of came from something for them, huh? That's weird. Well, hold on a second here. Used a weapon that can be used to destroy whites. Yeah, so how could a Jew use a weapon that can destroy whites? That would be odd. And then you think about, oh man, that Bible. See that Bible there that's made by Caucasian white people? That Bible, it has an edict in it where it's it's got a vengeance thing in there. And what you come to find out in the new black Hebrew Israelites is they say they are those people somehow, that they had come all the way to West Africa.
First of all, you're connecting things that don't even connect to one another. I want you to connect the Jewish people from the past, not modern people claiming to be Jewish people. I'm talking about the Jewish people from the past. I want you to connect them to this conspiracy theory because now you're going to try and connect them to a modern thing where you're going to try to tie the conspiracy theory together. And that's not going to work. Not for me.
Stayed in a knot, and that every single slave that came to America was. Anyhow, it gets real complicated, but this just kind of shatters, I guess, what they're trying to plan on doing. But let's look at this. Wow. I would like to invite all my black brothers and sisters to join me in untangling the lies, deceptions, and half truths that have been foisted upon us as a race, and to explore the true history of what's been done to us as a people by those who were more than happy to encourage us to think these wrong things were committed to us by whites, when in reality those crimes were carried out by Jews.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? And this is a very important question. If the Jews did this, how come today we speak English and Spanish and French and all the why don't we speak Jewish languages? Because it seems like where Jews went and dominated, people ended up speaking their languages. How come if they were dominating white people and black people at the time, how come we're not speaking their languages? Isn't that weird? Especially given the fact that again, when they were dominating, they speak their languages. When they're not dominating, like in Arabia, they spoke Arabic. When they're not dominating, like in the West, they spoke Western languages.
So let's go on here. What is this? So they show you the Jews here, and they've got even a map. It'll show you an area. Jews are a race of merchants and traders like the ancient Phoenicians who preceded them in occupation of Canaan and their establishment of trade throughout the Mediterranean. The Jews traveled far and wide in search of wealth and exotic riches long before the first white man ever set foot in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, nonsense. So there's a reason why this is nonsense. And it has nothing to do with did Jews first arrive in Africa before they're closer to Africa. They arrived in Africa, not sub-Saharan Africa. That means nothing to me. But in Africa in general, they arrived first than Europeans because they're closer to Africa. Now, this idea of Jews are merchants, really? All of them? Every single one of them is a merchant, are they? No kings, no queens, no slaves, no biblical, no scholars, no cotton weavers, no people who just go up trees and fetch food, no farmers. All of them are just merchants.
Maybe he's found Jews living in Sinna, Yemen, are known to have come to Ethiopia as early as 500 BC in search of gold. Intermarried
There are Jews who came to Ethiopia very early. The Sabaean kingdom is one of those. And no, they were not in search of gold. Gold is one of the things that you would search for back then. But what they really were searching for was expansion. By the way, a large amount of them were already Ethiopian by the time they left Israel.
with African women and becoming the ancestors of the Limba tribe, whose descendants continue to practice Judaism and went on to build Great Zimbabwe, a medieval stone fortress whose construction began as early as the 11th century.
So while it's possible and probable that the Lemba tribe had some Jewish ancestry in them, they have really nothing to do with Great Zimbabwe. We know who's responsible for Great Zimbabwe. It's the Shona people, well, people related to the Shona people, and other people who are of Bantu origin. The people who created Great Zimbabwe are Jewish. No, that's daydreaming. That's the same as saying that the people who, if you take any group, right, you find the closest group. So you find white people, right, in South Africa. You say the people who created, I don't know, I can't even think of an example. Something they're the Afrikaans people in South Africa. It's like no, just because there's other white people in South Africa doesn't mean everything that then comes from white people is necessarily to those specific white people. It doesn't even make sense. Now, I'm going to say this again. how does this fit into the idea that Jews are trying to remove white people by mixing the people up? Isn't that what they are if you add the Lemba people? Which, by the way, most archaeologists confirm that the Lemba people really have nothing to do with the construction of the ancient Zimbabwean area. In fact, we know who was responsible for the Zimbabwean. We know which tribes they were by names given by people who encountered them, like the Portuguese.
Okay, and I'm familiar with that. And a lot of people try to say that, that was Great Zimbabwe was built, 10,000 years ago. But there's records that they say that they did it, and the Jews were involved with this, huh?
So I'm also very familiar with the records that talk about Israel. And remember, I read you that thing about how someone said that the constructions of Great Zimbabwe are so fascinating that some people assume that the people might have come from that area and went to Israel to found that city. And this civilization is so impressive that it might be true that they come from there. That's the oldest that I can find that makes a Jewish connection. But again, this is different than an actual connection.
And what was that supposed to be at 500 BC? It was some type of, huh, some type of connection to where they could get connected with them and the gold that they could get out of the people. And then what do? They make them rise up against what last was Egypt, or no, that's 500 BC. That's before. That happens way before. Anyhow, the Ethiopian Bible is one of the few written texts outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls which includes the Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew text that relates how a group of angels disobeyed the prohibition against intermarrying with mortal women and how they spawned a race of cannibalistic giants who wreaked havoc on the earth during both man and beast, which ultimately had been destroyed in the time of Noah by the flood. The book of Enoch also reveals that the fallen angel who was singled out for punishment in this part was named Azazel, who was imprisoned under the earth to remain there until the day of judgment when he would finally be destroyed along with the death and the grave, a legend which seems to be the origin of the Christian belief of the devil.
So I'm just going to throw this out there. I know when the Ethiopian Bible or the Kabra Nagast was written, I know where to find it. I've read it before. I've read all of it, and a lot of it is religious. I mean, I have to say it, Bible babble, and it has no ties to historical reality in that sense. There are some realities, like when they talk about Sofala and when they talk about the Swahili coast, but at no point do they mention ever going there. So, in other words, they talk about it as a further expanse. Instead, what they do when they speak about the Jewish empire, which they include themselves, the Black Jews or the Ethiopian Jews, they extended from Israel through the Red Sea, through Egypt, and then through Ethiopia. And then they stop there and say, then there's the western side, which is unknown to us. And then they also say there's the southern side, which belongs to the blacks, not the black Jews, the other blacks, an unknown area. Now, the Lemba is actually one of those interesting things because the Lemba might descend from people who are Jewish, but were black Jews. So, in other words, where they have, Israeli history and they're also black Jews in the sense, blah, 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 whatever sense you want to take it. But they then fuse with the people who live in the Swahili coast through Somalia, someplace like that, and then make their way into Zimbabwe. This could happen between any time between 1000 AD all the way to around, the 1600s, 1700s, and you would still get the same result. First of all, not all Lemba have been found to have Semitic traces. Two, not all of them claim to be Jewish. Three, I mean, that second one is important because it might have been, and this has been thrown out there, Muslims who came and landed in that area and then converted to the Jewish religion. A sign of this is picking up some modern Jewish ideas. If you go look at Jewish places around the world, you will see there's some ideas that came about in the last 300 years, which they carry now in those Jewish communities, which tells you that, again, they picked it up later. When I say Jewish, by the way, I mean real Jewish. So these people, they don't read any Christian texts. They just read the Jewish Bible, Old Testament, if you will, and then they read other Jewish texts.
And yeah, there's really no devil thing. And then they talk about this in the Bible and they go, see, there's the devil, and they try to put it together. But I'll tell you something weird. Azazel, if you'll go to that, where it has it in there, it's actually the scapegoat. And what they do is they, now imagine this while we're reading something like this. But what they do is they have two unblemished goats, and they take one for the Lord, and the other they put all the sins of the people on and cast it out into the wilderness and throw it off a cliff.
So this guy knows a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then he puts them all together. So it is true that the word scapegoat comes from escaped goat, which comes to the goat that they put the sins on, and then it escapes into the wilderness, blah, 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 blah. But that has nothing to do with what we were talking about earlier. First of all, the devil was something that was created far, like, long time ago, like before even the Judeo religion really existed. So while the Zoroastrian religion is not necessarily the first religion in the world ever, possibly, but not the first to ever be monotheistic, we got Egypt there. But while it's one of the first, it also has a devil in there. And the devil is the opposite of Ahura Mazda, which is the name of their god. Angra Mainyu, I think is his name, but we'll get back to that. Basically, the thing that he's saying, it's true that in the Hebrew Bible, quote, in the Ethiopian Bible, or the one of the Kebra Nagast or whatever, there is some label of other gods or other demons, but this is again a stretch to say that this is the oldest depiction of the devil. That is not a fact at all.
So it can die for all of their sins, and then they're cleansed again, because they can do whatever the hell they want to as long as they throw a goat at it. By the way, any of these new Hebrew Israelites killing goats and doing things? As a matter of fact, has anybody ever seen in a synagogue a goat getting killed? Is anybody doing this anymore? Did anybody ever really do it back in the day? Or was it something that was really from before Christ's time that was going on that got stopped by Rome? And then from then on, it's been a puppet thing ever since.
So we're all very familiar of how Jesus came to be. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, according to the Christian faith. And so after that, Jews stopped sacrificing animals. Remember, they used to sacrifice animals to forgive their sins. And then apparently, once you sacrifice, but this is in Christianity. Now, the Jews who don't believe in Christianity have their own reason for why they don't sacrifice animals anymore. But again, he's using Christianity as if it's like the foundation or the beginning. It's not the beginning of the Judeo religion. And yes, if you go read Cain and Abel, Abel sacrifices a goat while Cain tries to sacrifice fruit and stuff like that, which God does not appreciate, because he says, why should I sacrifice that when why should I sacrifice animals? So let's read this quick part of the Bible about Cain and Abel. So Adam made love with his wife, Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of his fruits of soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of his firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offerings, but on Cain and his offerings he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. So this is one of those Bible verses that I heard as a kid, which also made me upset as a kid, which is, the guy is taking care of animals So obviously Abel is more likely. Why are you making Cain angry? Where is he supposed to get the animals from? He's not he's not in charge of that. But it's one of those confusing verses. Then it says, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and got rid of him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And then Abel said, I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? So this is that story of Cain and Abel. Very short. After this, Cain runs away, finds some cavemen and stuff like that. It's very interesting after this what happens. But still, it contradicts what that guy was saying, that there's no one in the Bible who sacrifices animals. They sacrificed animals up until later, years later, like until Jesus, really. And even after Jesus, there were some Jews still sacrificing animals.
Sense. And that's the truth of it. But we'll go on here. So here's an area of all of Africa and how huge it is. And you get Djibouti down here in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and these areas here where the Egyptians used to be able to come down off the Red Sea and do trade and up the Nile to a point, but got stopped. And Sudan occasionally came down the Nile. So here we have.
Well, at least he's not a complete dunderhead, and he does understand that the Egyptians did do trade with the Ethiopians and Sudanese. Because I know some of these guys deny that. They're like, no, they would never go down to the south.
Have also the very top states here, Tripoli, Al-Jaf, Belgies, and Tunisia. All the northern parts here were Islamic taken over with, and Jews, and they ended up taking over this spot through here. They infiltrated to them.
So I'm so glad that I actually had videos on this subject. Remember, Jews just happened to live in these Islamic countries. They were not in control. In fact, not only were they not in control, they were somewhat threatened as a people.
And what did they do with this? Well, this is where the slave trade comes from, right through in here, you know, Nigeria even. All over the place. He's got a map showing you the areas. But anyhow, Judea, the land.
So you will remember that the majority of slaves that went to the Americas actually come from the southern side, the Christian side of West Africa. So nowhere near that area. Only a small portion of them went from there to America, from Nigeria and plus to America. Keep that in mind as this person tries to lie to us.
From which the Jews take their name was located on the Levant, in what is today the present state of Israel and the Mediterranean coast that lies beyond Jordan, along the western edge of Arabia. Bordering on Egypt and northern Africa, there are Jews lived there nearly 1,000 years until they're eventually expelled and driven into exile by Romans against those who the Jewish people repeatedly rebelled. And they did, in fact.
So it's absolutely true that the Romans at one point did some stuff to the Jews, but we don't need to get deep into this. This again is, I feel he's putting in a long show of history, which of course we have evidence that Jews had been expelled by other people as well in the early days, but we'll get back to that in the Elephantine texts.
The Jews revolted everywhere. Looking into it deeply, it seemed like they would infiltrate the Amalekites and these people and cause rebellions and do things. And anytime they ever got enslaved by a people, they would rebel inside the own thing that there was. And in fact, this right here is showing you where they rebelled against Rome, and it actually caused the Armageddon that was in the Bible.
So every time they were slaves, they would rebel. What a bunch of evil people.
Jesus tells you at the Mount of Olives it's going to be 40 years or a generation, and that some of his apostles are not going to taste death before it actually comes, the second coming. And the second coming, because he died in 33, is at 73 when this actually ends at the plains of Masada at Armageddon or Armageddon. and every single Jew pretty much got killed off. There were scatterings left.
So yes, he's basing this all on some biblical, history. But I want to see how far he can take it before I start cracking it for him.
By the way, they weren't black.
Well, according to the book you just read, some of them definitely were.
But Judea, which is strange, where the Jews take their names from, because Saturn and El worship of that area. El was the god of the Levant, and he was known by Greeks and Romans as Saturn and Kronos. And El had a son, and they tell you about it in Berosus and some of these old things that were right about the time here, and that he had his only begotten son named Eudid, and in Greek that would be Eusus, which actually is Jesus, because there is no J until 1300s.
So the word Judeo doesn't come from a uses, but we'll get back to where it actually comes from because I don't want to sit here and have a biblical debate.
And so the land, by the way, they say they named the whole land from him and they called it Eudea. And if you find out there is no J, then this land of Judea they talk about doesn't exist, and it was always called Judea, and it was named after his kid Eudeid. And in fact,
Okay, so let's just put it: the 12 tribes of Israel, one of them is Judea. That's why they have that name. So it was not necessarily the name of the entire area.
when Jesus comes, it's just his name written in Greek again. And it's all a story. If you look up Flavian signature, you'll see how Titus and the siege of Rome is actually played out, and word for word or time for time through the Bible, it actually locks up. I mean, I had most of what he had. He found a few I didn't have. I have a couple he didn't have. And it all adds up to just this correlation of things that add up to where.
So, of course, it's not impossible that a lot of the Greek writings and Roman writings ended up in the Bible. Persian writings ended up in the Bible. Zoroaster and people like that. Egyptian works ended up in the Bible. And then, of course, once you get to the New Testament, then the way of writing that mimics their captives or the captors happens. For example, Revelation is written in the style in apocalyptic language, which was typical at that time of the Greco-Roman people.
So anyhow, they caused these Jewish uprisings. The Roman Empire crushed Jewish uprisings, destroyed their most sacred site, the temple in Jerusalem, left no stone standing, and driving the Jews out of Judea, sending them wandering to other parts of the Roman city. Took a sword, split the curtain too, by the way, and said, "Your shit's over and get the hell out." And they killed them all. But actually, the Jews ended up killing themselves whenever they were trapped inside the temple there. The others had gotten loose and they tracked them down, but the ones that were inside the temple poisoned themselves and killed their own children and everybody so they wouldn't be eaten.
Okay, so now he's just yammering on about the Judeo text. What is the point? Get to the point.
And a strange, nah, I'm not going to go there. You'll have to, I was going to tell you something neat, but watch Flavian Signature and he'll tell you something neat about the last Passover and how it was put together and how it really is. And you wonder why Jesus wants you to eat of his flesh. Once the Jews had been driven out of Jerusalem, they soon reestablished their former trade connections and set themselves up as merchants and traders throughout the Roman Empire and abroad, continuing to practice their native religion of Judaism, refusing to assimilate into the societies they settled and profited from. They would always be this separate little thing. They got this own little deal, their own little church, and it's a weird little thing, and it's all about Jews, and you're not a Jew, so you can't be part of it, right?
So, as we know, this is absolutely incorrect. Jewish people put lots of people inside of their texts. It's not something that happened once or twice. It's something that happened consistently. The earliest one is when one of the temples got attacked in Israel, and a Persian, this is very old, a Persian went and fixed it. They used to not have any texts about this, only coming from the Bible, but now there's 3 proofs for it, 4 if you count the one in Israel, although a lot of people, they have a problem with the one from Israel. But one of them comes from Egypt, from Elephantine, and I'm going to read that one now. The other one comes from Persia itself, and then of course there's the one in the Bible, which we don't have to read because it's a very famous one. So here's the text from ancient Egypt. We grew increased detachments of the Egyptian rebelled. We did not leave our post. Now you'll read that a lot of it is missing, some of the text. So it's going to be broken English. And anything of damage was not found in us in year 14 of King Darius, when our Lord Arsamas went to the king. This is the evil act which the priests of Nub, the god, did in Elephantine, the fortress. In agreement with Vidranga, who was the chief here, they gave him silver and goods. There is part of the royal barley house, which is in Elephantine. The fortress, they demolished it and built a wall in the midst of the fortress of Elephantine. And now that wall stands built in the midst of the fortress. There is a well which was built within the fortress and which did not lack water to give the garrison drink, so that whenever they would be garrisoned there, they would drink the water in that well. Those priests of Nub stopped up that well if inquiry be made of the judges, police, and hearers who are appointed in the province of Treshes. It would be known to our Lord in accordance with this which we say. Moreover, we are separated. Hapni, which our Elephantine fortress, we grew increased, was not found in to bring meal offering. Okay. To offer there to Yahweh, the God, in which, the redacted, but a brazier, not redacted, but gone. The fitting they took and made them their own. I, or if it please our Lord, much missing. We from the garrison missing. If it please our Lord, may an order be issued missing. We, if it please our Lord, they protect the thing which to build our temple, which they demolished. So you can see here, there is information about the rebuilding of a temple of Yahweh in ancient Egypt, or at least Roman Egypt. The stories of from the Roman Egypt times, of what time it is,
You're just goyim, right? You'll never get anywhere in it now, right? So they also brought with them the recently formed Jewish cult of Christianity, which they soon spread outside the Jewish diaspora and was adopted by many members of the slave class in the ancient Roman society, who founded Christianity's doctrine of equality and brotherhood as appealing to the Christian admonishment, condemning those who sought to increase their worldly riches and power over others. Man, this
So this, of course, goes against what he said earlier, saying that the Christian part of the Bible was written by Greeks and Romans. No, it was written by Jews, but these Jews were way more open-minded about who could become a Jew, and they used the word Jew to mean spiritual Jew rather than all of that. And then they use certain evidences. From then on, you will see lots of people, even Maimonides, lots of Jews who argue that in the Bible, at no point does it say the special people are just the Jewish people, even though it does at some point. And also it mentions other people who are special, but no one ever points at that.
brother can write. You ought to stop and pause and read that, not as fast as I'm trying to go through it here, but pause in the correct spots and give emphasis to the words. That shit's strong. Christianity was brought to Ethiopia by Frumentius, a Lebanese-born Christian who came to Bishop Axum and saw Christianity became the state of religion of Ethiopia in the year 330 AD.
So, as we know, Christianity had actually hit Ethiopia way earlier than the state, but for it to become the main state religion, that took a much longer time. You will hear people say all kinds of things about Ethiopia and how old the Bible in Ethiopia is and all of that, but let's not focus on that now. I must remind you that there definitely were Christians inside of Ethiopia before that specific date where it started to be accepted as a state religion, the same as in Nubia as well. We must also make a separation between Ethiopia and the other Ethiopia. The biblical Ethiopia is Cush or close to Cush. Actually, I'll take that back. The biblical Ethiopia is above Cush. It's not necessarily Cush. And that Ethiopia is tied to the area of the Kandake. That's when you start to get the connection between Cush and the Ethiopians in general. And then they're mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned that an Ethiopian of the kingdom of Candace goes to Israel and is converted to Christianity by I think it was Peter, one of them people converted him.
And they brought writing to him and stuff, supposedly. Map the network. Here we go. So what it is here is that the
So the lie here is the idea that writing was brought by the Christians into Ethiopia. That is not true. There's Jewish texts that go back years. Sabaeans and people like that are the most likely people to bring the modern form of writing that could have been translated. Now, it's possible that the Ethiopian writing, just like everything else, was inspired by the ancient Egyptian texts, Sabaean mix, all of that, Proto-Sinaitic. But this idea that it was the Christians is not true at all.
blue lines are the Jewish networks, and the purple lines are known trade routes. And so you almost see how they're working off little different trade routes. You see that? But they're working in those places, but they're working in.
No, we can't see it because you chose to make your screen record, I don't know, with a phone or something on a PC instead of putting it on the screen.
Strange and mysterious ways. Wherever the Jews settled, they soon garnered the animosity of those who they lived among, owing their unscrupulous business practices and usury. This is where they would tax you money for borrowing money and things, and pawn shop kind of shit.
So we will get into that deeper in another part of it because it's kind of tricky. But let's not go down the rabbit hole of Jewish people lending money and stuff. There's lots of people who lent money in those days, especially in Asiatic world. That type of borrowing had already been established in those areas. But in the idea that they were kicked out because of high tax and all the other stuff, that's not even an important thing because 90% of the kingdoms, first of all, let's take the Egyptians. The Egyptians rebelled against the Persians because the Persians didn't want to build temples because they wanted to reduce taxes. So this idea that everybody is against taxes is not a real thing. It depends what your state is like. And then number two, by the way, the Persians thought they were doing good when they were doing that. Like, you notice there's a trend of Persians trying to help the population, but their help is like uninvited sometimes.
Writing in the 1st century, the Roman geographer Strabo said of them, the Jews had been penetrated in every city, and it'd be difficult to find a single place in the inhabited world where it has not received this race, where it has not become a master. So they come in and they start taking over. 1st century Roman Tacitus.
So maybe this quote exists within the text of Strabo, but I don't see it. Now, here's the thing. The Jews mentioned by Strabo here, consisting of Romans in Egypt, as also of Roman allies, among whom were 500 Jews and 1,000 Nabateans under Silius. After many experiences and hardships, he arrived in 14 days and Lake Como in the land of the Nabateans, a large emporium, although he had lost many of his boats, some of these being lost to crews and all of blah blah. So even if I take his quote as he puts it, and I saw it on PBS, but I can't find any real thing. He says in the civilized world. Now, how far did the civilized world stretch for Strabo?
Also held a similarly unfavorable opinion of them, saying the practice of the Jews are malevolent and despicable. They have entrenched themselves by their very degeneracy, deviants of the most depraved kind who had no use for the religion and their predecessors. They took to collecting dues and contributions in order to swell the Jewish treasury, and other reasons for increasing wealth that may be found in their unrelenting loyalty and eagle nepotism towards their fellow Jews.
So, when reading this part, it's important to understand again the context, which is the duality here. But let's first just read it. Whatever their origin, these rites are maintained by their antiquity. The other customs of the Jews are base and abominable. Now, I want you guys to think about what he just said there. He said, the other customs of the Jews, whatever their origin, these rites are maintained by their antiquity. The other customs of the Jews are base and abominable, and owe their persistence to their depravity. For the worst rascals among other peoples, renouncing their ancestral religions, always kept sending tribute and contributions to Jerusalem, thereby increasing the wealth of the Jews. Again, the Jews are extremely loyal towards one another and always ready to show compassion, but towards every other people, they feel only hate and enmity. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart. And although as a race they are prone to lust, they abstain from intercourse with foreign women. Yet among themselves, nothing is unlawful. They adopted circumcision to distinguish themselves from other peoples. By this difference, those who are converted to their ways follow the same practice, and the earliest lesson they receive is to despise the gods, to disown their country, and to disregard their parents, children, and brothers as of little account. However, they take thought to increase their numbers, for they regard it as a crime to kill any late born child, and they believe that the soul of those who are killed in battle are by the executioner immortal. Hence comes their passion for begetting children and their scorn of death. They bury the body rather than burn it, thus following the Egyptians' customs. I wasn't going to read this part, but I think it's interesting, especially considering that Strabo himself was a non Judeo person. Things, okay, the Egyptians worship many animals and monstrous images. The Jews conceive of one God only, and that with the mind alone they regard as impious those who make from perishable materials representations of gods in man's image. That supreme and eternal being is to them incapable of representation and without end. Therefore, they set up no statues in their cities, still less in their temples. This flattery is not paid their kings, nor this honor given to the Caesars, but since their priests used to chant to the accompaniment of pipes and cymbals, and to wear garlands of ivy, and because a golden vine was found in their temple, some have thought that they were devotees.
Wow. But all the rest of the world hold in contempt with hatred reserved for enemies. Yeah, it's just the Jews. Everyone else is. Now, people don't know this, but the old Bible, it's just about the Jews, and it's just about the Jews, and everybody else is goyim and cattle. And no.
So let's say the truth here and the lies. So here you can see Strabo is talking about the certain type of Jews holding to themselves, but he also mentions that they don't necessarily, pay attention to their own origin as much as other people who are good people, in his own words. And then the second part where he says here, the Bible is just about Jews, that is fake. The Jews only come later in the Bible. In fact, again, they are part of the 12 tribes of Israel. If I were to ask you who is the first Jewish person, if you've ever been to Bible school, you can answer this question. Abraham. In Jewish texts, he's referred to as Avenu Avraham, which is Abanu in the Semitic language, meaning father, Abraham. This is similar to Avenu Melkenu, which is our father, our king, for God.
If you try to get into their religion, they go, "You're in my religion, goyim cattle. You're not."
Okay, so here's another misinterpretation that he makes. I didn't even realize that he was making this mistake by what he was saying. He said that the people did not allow other people to join the religion. Strabo said the opposite. He said the converts, meaning the people who joined the religion, they also started to pick up the same stuff as the Jews, meaning that in this case, the Jews as a race converted other people into their one God or uni-deity idea. Now, remember again, the first uni-deity ever recorded is between the Egyptian deity of Aten or Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians.
You're not a Jew. So you're not going to get to heaven no matter what you do. Nobody but the Jews. It's one silly way to prove that this nomadic Persian tent people that couldn't find a place, that has to cause genocide to steal a place.
So I hate that this guy can't keep a straight line, because what he's saying is somewhat important. It's just broken by the fact that he is moving all over the place. So the part that's important of what he is saying is the part about is the idea that the Jews said that the only people who can get into heaven are the Jews, which maybe the Jews did say that, but the Bible doesn't. The Bible explicitly says things like, "Are you not Ethiopians unto me?" and "Bring all the nations under God." We've got so many statements like this, and there's even statements that say, "Cursed are the Jews who have turned their face on away from God."
El, they used to worship him with his council, and the council was called the Elohim. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And they worshipped in a place they called a Temp El or a Chapel.
So it's true that the word El does come from the Asiatic areas, but this religious nonsense that he's about to spew right now is fake etymology. The word chapel comes from the word kapal or kapalet, which means cloak. It does not come from chapel, and angel doesn't come from El and all of this other stuff, and Mikael doesn't come from Meek and then El.
And because it's a place of El. Like Bethel is house of God, where house is Beth and El is the name of God. Yeah, and so the elders used to tell everybody what to do there, and they were directed by the angel.
So here, this is proof that this is a lie. The word chapel is Italian, right? It comes from that area of the world. The word elder is Germanic in origin. And no, it's not elder. He's just using the word El and just throwing it everywhere. This is a typical thing of people who consider themselves linguists.
Named Michael, but Michael, or Ariel, or Gabriel, or Nathaniel. No, that wasn't an angel, was it? Raphael? All the angels. They all have El names. Well, there was prophets that tried to keep them from doing the Baal worship. Yes, their names were Ezekiel, Daniel.
So I don't know what's his obsession with this word El, but we will see later when he comes back to it. I want to see how we get to slavery from here.
Nathanael, how about Elijah? That means El is Yahweh. Let's try to say what
So this one is even worse. El here means my. So it's El Iwa or Elijah. My God is Yahweh. The word El here is used generically for my God.
means God is Yahweh. No, God, if you're saying El is God, that's the God of the Levant. His name is El. He was a satyr. He was the one to talk about as being satyr, Saturn himself. He was a satyr, the half goat guy, because they used to still wear goat clothes and skins in a time when Roman and Greeks were all eating, grapes and stuff. So they made fun of him, especially when they got in fights with him. Then they started making all the goat horns. We know what we think about a goat horn guy today, but they even they worshipped it so much. The Romans worshipped Saturn to the point that the main mound of Rome used to be called Saturnus Mons, where the Vatican sits today.
The association with Saturn is that brought by the Greco-Romans onto these people in the same way that later writers would put the same person, I think it was Jupiter or Saturn, one of those two, on the black people.
So they definitely were deep into it and loved it. And his son, Baal, which would be known to them as Zeus. And if you remember Greek stuff, that's his son. Of course, he ate all of his children except for one, and that goes back to that Eudid Judea thing. So amazing, isn't it, how it all goes together? But I want y'all to pause this at certain points here. I'll give you 10 seconds, pause it.
I want to state as a fact that it is true that 3 of these are gods in that area. El is a god, Baal is a god, and so is Yahweh, a god in the Asiatic regions. But we must be careful about mixing these up and mixing these mythologies together, because a lot of these are mixed in to destroy the other religion.
Here and just read this that here is here. Y'all can go to this site and see this. I'll stop at a few points, but he talks about how the Dutch East Indies Shipping Company, that we're all familiar with as the pirates, was actually Jewish controlled and owned.
So you will be surprised to hear that the founders of the Dutch East India Company were not Jewish, though there were some backers who were Jewish, but the founders were definitely not. And here's the thing that is the most important. They engaged in slavery almost immediately. These people, whatever you want to call them, Dutch, whatever, they used slavery to gain a lot of their money, especially in Asia first, going through the same thing that a lot of people had been going through in that area. They did not invent slavery, so I don't know why he's pointing at the Dutch East India Company. And no, it's not true that the white people sat by with their arms folded while the Jews did slavery. That's not what happened. So I've mentioned before, when I talk about the diaspora of the Jews and how large it is, right? There's some in South Africa, some in Nigeria, some in those places, especially those of mixed origin, not white people who say they're Jews now and they live in those areas. And one that I mentioned was the Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews are the ones in the Iberian areas, the Portuguese areas. These are a good chunk of them who moved to the Amsterdam areas and contributed to the Dutch East India and the Dutch West Indian Company. So again, we have to mention something, right? So white, that's the general term used for the people who did the transatlantic slave trade. And that is a correct term. It wasn't all Jewish people. That is a falsity. In fact, at one time, I think it was something like 20,000 Jews were in America. And then the rest of them were like different types of white people of the white population. I also mentioned earlier that he has to mention the people, the Jews living in Sao Tome. He has to mention the Jews living in Luanda. He has to mention the Jews living in, any of these slaver bay areas. Otherwise, he's not even in the conversation yet. Now, something I do know is that there were Jews in those areas. 100% there were Jews, but they were not the majority at all. And in fact, you know how we know they're not the majority? Because they pretended not to be Jews. Now, this is a history The Secret Life of the Jews. This is a history of Jewish people that happened a lot because they were targeted, right, as a population. A lot of the time, they would pretend to be other types of people. So, in other words, in Morocco, they would pretend to be Muslims. In Europe, they would pretend to be Christians of different variations, depending on where they were. In Sao Tome, they would have pretended to be Portuguese. They pretended to be Catholic and all these other things, but they wouldn't have pretended if they were the majority in those slaver bays. Like in places where they got and they were the majority or they were tolerated, they just came out as Jews. That's why in the Dutch East India Company, they come out as Jews. Now, there's another person we should add here who was in the Dutch East India Company and he hated Jews. His name was Peter Stuyvesant. And he said, okay, there's a Stuyvesant Square in Manhattan at 16th Street and 2nd Avenue with a statue of Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of its New Amsterdam colony, a Stuyvesant High School and Stuyvesant Town residential development. At least one group wants these places renamed, and the Stuyvesant was an extreme racist who targeted Jews and other minorities, including Catholics, and energetically tried to prohibit them from settling in then New Amsterdam. So in 1647, Peter Stuyvesant became the Director General of New Netherlands. Stuyvesant increased the number of enslaved Africans in the colony and became the largest owner of enslaved Africans in New Netherland. Under Stuyvesant's direction, enslaved Africans labored as caulkers, blacksmiths, bricklayers, and masons to make improvements to the slow growing colony. In some cases, the enslavement were given half freedom, meaning when their labor was not needed, and in order to cut expenses for the company, they would be given their freedom. However, this freedom was contingent on the fact that they were bound to provide labor upon demand and that their children were not born free. Towards the end of the Dutch control over New Amsterdam, most Africans in the colony continued to be owned and work for the Dutch West Indies Company. Stuyvesant, who owned 40 slaves, was the largest private slave owner in the 1660. In 1660, he supervised what was probably Manhattan's first public auction of human beings, the largest cargo of enslaved Africans. 290 people arrived in New Amsterdam in 1664 on the Gideon, just before the colony was taken over by the British. Peter Stuyvesant and company officials in the Netherlands corresponded about the need for additional labor and the importing of more enslaved Africans. So, of course, it'll be no surprise that this person will speak very ill of black people, but let's read it. So he says, Peter Stuyvesant, in regard to the Negroes, which the honorable directors ordered to be sent hither, they ought to be stout and strong fellows, fit for immediate employment on this fortress and other works. Also, if required in war against the wild barbarians, either to pursue them when retreating or else to carry some of the soldiers' baggage, it being very apparent that we shall be constrained to wage a righteous and offensive war against them for the peaceable possession once of the land and the avenging of numerous suffered affronts and murders. An important service would be conferred on the company, on us and the country, if there were among the sold Negroes some of experience who have resided a certain time at Curaçao. Now, again, the only reason I'm making this video is because the people are trying to excuse white people of their role in slavery by saying it's all Jewish. But I don't want to be one of these black people who does that thing of like, during the civil rights, we were held hand in hand. I don't, nah, I'm not talking about none of that. The Jews did play a role in slavery. And anyone really who was in Europe, in Asia, parts of Africa, and was, of those whiter races, they engaged in slavery. This is especially important when we think about the majority of the people that would have existed in these areas.
Shipping company they were all familiar with as the Pirates was actually Jewish controlled and owned. And how they took over certain areas and colonies that got started in America.
So this part is especially important. So a group of Sephardic Jews went to Brazil and they did aid in the slave trade. And I don't just mean they gave money, because a lot of people want to act like that's all they did. They engaged in slavery. They owned plantations. They owned slaves, all of that in the region. But they did this partially in hiding. In other words, they weren't necessarily going around saying they're Jewish. And the reason why they did that is because the majority, first, the people who first got there were Portuguese, but then the majority of the people there were open Christian people, and they hated the religion of the the Jewish religion, which a lot of people say that's anti-Semitic, but we'll get it. This is not a conversation about that. To me, anti-Semitic has more to do with the hate of the people more than the race, more than the religion.
You can go back and look at that if you want. Pause it. I'm just going to go through this. But they started selling slaves. And when they did, they started bringing people over, and all these people are Abraham and Isaac and all this, and they're all Jewish people, and they were listed on the 1656 list as being the word Juden, like what they call them in Germany and shit. And then 1671, they were started to be calling Hebrew or Hebrews.
So you notice here again, he's gone back to the Dutch East Indian Company. So under the Dutch, the Jews felt open to call themselves Jews. That's why Stuyvesant is talking about them as Jews. Like, okay, I don't like the Jews because this is how they deal in business, and they're this type of race, and blah 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 blah. That's because they're open about being Jewish, and the type of Judaism that starts to form in the Americas is very different than the one that is in the old world, so Europe.
Rather than Jews. So they're trying to say there's something different. And all the slaves that they sold, they give Hebrew names to. So when people go back in their track and they can't find anything past this guy named, I don't know, some Jew name like Abraham, and they go, see, we were Jews. And it's like, no, you got owned by a Jew, and they put that name on you when they sold you. And
so it is absolutely true that some Jews absolutely sold people during the slave trade. And this is where it gets different, because I know some people who they act like the Jews are just pure victims of history, but of course they participate in some very bad things. And this isn't something new. This is where it confuses me. I feel like a lot of Americans have a very different version of what Jews are, of the Jewish history, than other people. When the people said, did you know that the Jews were in slavery? At least the people who call themselves Jews, Sephardic Jews, and all these other type Ashkenazi, all these people. I wonder if that's like a big shock in America, because everywhere else it's not. During the Arab slave trade, Jews traded slaves, both black and white. By the way, they didn't just trade them, they also were slave owners. And also, there's a lot of racism in Israel. But they're using this I think misunderstanding by Americans who are probably taught that Jews are like super nice or something. I don't know where they're getting this from. And then when they find that they were involved in the slave trade, they exaggerated to mean they ran the slave trade, which couldn't be further from the truth. The one in the Middle East ran by Arabs, the one in the Arabs, Persians, all of those other people. And then the ones in the West ran by Europeans in general, including Jews. People who claim to be Jews.
Kind of sucks, but most of them got renamed another name by their new owners because they didn't like Jews. Nobody liked Jews. There was a long time where people didn't like Jews. You hear about this anti-Semitism, and it's because people are against Jews. And of course, what does that mean? Well, it's because of what they've done to humanity through the time. Well, you've got to lay up off of them. They wrote the Bible. No, what is the
So again, it's absolutely true that Jews were hated for a long time in history in different parts. I mean, I've read you them. Okay, so first let's talk about how they ended up in Africa. So they get kicked out of Spain. From Spain, they go to Portugal. I mean, the Iberian areas in general. They get kicked out of there, and then they end up in Morocco. From Morocco, they end up in Africa. What happened there? Well, they end up in Africa where they can do a little bit of trade, blah, blah, blah. But then in comes the Moroccans again inside of Africa, and they tell them, no, you have to get rid of these Jews because they're deceivers. The only Jews left over are the ones that are mixed. This is an important part of history that people don't know about. These Jews also went to the Ottoman Empire. These Jews also went to Egypt. They went everywhere. They went to the Americas. That's an important one. Of course, we have read that Jews were already attacked by the Islamic world. So even previous to this date, in the very early times. Not to mention, if we keep going back, I read you that thing about the Persians fixing up one of the temples of the Jews that were attacked. When you hyper focus on the Jews in this way, it seems like bad things are happening to them. But if you isolate another group, right, the Romaji, which people call gypsies, you're going to get a very similar history where it seems like they're getting kicked around about, as well. If you focus on, there's this weird focus you can do on specific types of people. The only ones that you can't really focus and get this are the ones who are doing all the kicking people about.
Bible do too? I mean, it's time for the Bible to go bye-bye. It's time to go disintegration. It's not productive. It's very counterproductive. It makes people hate each other for a little piece of land that really isn't even worth having anymore, is it? I mean, really? Just wasteland? Desert?
Well, that's a strange statement from someone who was quoting from the Bible earlier. If you're an atheist, then I'd be like, okay, that's just your opinion. And, you could say that you don't really like the Bible. I will say that fighting a war over a piece of land and then using religious or ancient doctrine to do that to people now is kind of crazy, especially considering the fact that the people fighting for each other are similar looking to one another. And their religion is so similar to one another. It's like, ugh, that's a hard one to fix. Now, obviously, I understand that if like somebody came and took part of South Africa and said, let's fight, then we have to fight. But,
I mean, it was great when the last ice age was there and the ice shelves were closed in, and that was probably a fertile crescent right there. But when it's spread out and turned into a desert, let's not do it. And we better be worried a little bit more about our next ice age that's coming, our mini ice age that should be here in the next few hundred years. Maybe even overdue at this point. And everybody's talking about global warming. Anyhow, pause it here. Rhode Island to Holland, Jesuit Israel. Then they talk about how they infiltrated Freemasonry before the actual start of America.
This fast run through history is not helping us because, again, this is a very nuanced conversation because, again, we're talking about Europeans of a specific ethnic group being involved in European things. And so it's very difficult to just be like, oh, no, this didn't happen or this did happen. It's like you're talking about Europeans involved in other European stuff. And yes, there is a secret version of Jewish people because they were targeted so much that they would hide their ethnicity sometimes. And we know this because some of them would admit who they were at death. So, like when they'll get buried, their family, blah, blah, blah.
And indoctrinated people in, like George Washington and things, with secret little rites they would do. And how they took wealthy people in on it. I could read all this to you, man, but it is long. It would go long, long, long. So I'm just going to pause it at each one so you can read it yourself, or you can go to this site yourself. We thought they were white. Just Google it and it'll pop right up. So they end up getting huge tracts of land. Huge tracts of land here. And in the American Revolution, they start funding it from both sides, kind of, with these guys.
So during this time, a lot of people were playing a lot of people, promising freedom to specific people, fighting, basically using Native Americans to fight their battles and then turn on them later. And all of this stuff was happening by different people. But again, we're speed running it now because this video is already long enough.
And actually trying to fund the fights that we had with Spain and things somewhat. Very hooked up with the Spanish slave trade and all their ships and all the people that had the ships back then. Moses Hayes, slave trader, banker. So let's go on here real quick. I want to try to get through with this in maybe a 35, 40-minute video, but Jews in the slave trade. This is where the Jews had set up their slave trade. It wasn't until 1655 that slavery for life became legally sanctioned institution in the Northern American colonies, however. In that year, Anthony Johnson, a free black Angolian who had been brought to Virginia as an undentured servant and who had worked off his term. What we mean by that, people, everybody used to work off their term. Everybody used to be an undentured servant. In fact, all the blacks, up until that moment right there, were set free after 7 years, and they could make their own little land and help to cultivate, and you would get a colony going on, with free people. Not slavery for life, but he worked off his term years earlier. He went to court over the ownership of a black servant named John Kaser, who Johnson claimed ownership of, saying that Kaser had been sold to him as a slave for life. Corroborating testimony in the case provided by a Jewish merchant named Captain Samuel Goldsmith, with the court deciding in Johnson's favor, legally recognizing John Kaser as his slave for life, setting the precedent for lifetime slave ownership in the colonies of North America, a peculiar institution that Jewish seafaring merchants and traders soon found extremely profitable.
So calling it indentured is actually kind of, not okay. But we read with Stuyvesant there and other people like that it is true that in a lot of the cases back then, it was not the most profitable thing to do to keep a slave for life and things like that. But you noticed with the writing there that some of their children would be still considered slaves. So they would be used as slaves, even though they were free and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff here that's being written in a very deceiving way. Like it's deceptive in the way that's written.
So there's the trick right there, where you went. And by the way, there are more white slaves up until this point. There are more white slaves that have come in and done this 7-year thing than black people at this point. Now's when it goes crazy.
So this is where it gets tricky again. So the racial element of slavery did already exist before that specific date, 1660. But there is a difference, that it wasn't as harsh as what would happen later, especially with the increase of the chattel slavery that would come after this. But as you read there, Stuyvesant was one of the biggest slave owners in New Amsterdam, and he only had a couple hundred people. After that, it would be like crazy, the numbers that one person could own. And remember, Stuyvesant is one of the people who increased the number of African slaves coming through. Now, were there Jewish people who played a role in the racial slavery of Africans? Absolutely. Were they the majority? You all know the answer to that question.
I'm going to start going ahead and read it, but here's people that were involved in the slave trade, and this is the names of their ships that they took back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. These are known slave ships. I don't know how much of the slave trade it encompasses, but if they're going back and forth constantly and we end up only with, South America got 92% of the slave trade. We got 4 to 6% of the slave trade. You could cover that with these ships going back and forth in just a 10, 15-year period, 20-year period, easily.
Now, again, this is important information, especially for people who believe that the Jews were just like some innocent people. in the history, because I don't know where they got that idea from.
Hmm. Here's the guys that, and see, look, they look white, right? They just look white, right? That's whitey in a wig. No, that's Jew in a whitey wig. That's just infiltration right there, I guess. Instead of being the long bearded guy with a little block on his forehead Jew thing, no.
So let's do a quick talk about what these wigs are. These wigs were to cover sores on the heads of these European people. These wigs needed to be large because the sores that came from syphilis, and in some cases other diseases, they could stick out of your head. And so these big wigs, as they were called, they would put these giant wigs in order to hide those sores. Now you can imagine, because again, this was what was happening back in the day, where people are losing their teeth because they're eating too much sugar. They think they're living the life, but they're losing their teeth. They're getting these sores because of STDs. And you can see why some people would turn to the afterlife and turn to God in situations like this. No matter how much money you make, you can still run into disease and die, and or be completely disfigured.
Oh, that guy looks Jewish right there. Let me pull it down so you can grab and read this. Jacob Rivera, all these guys. It shows you how they start going south with everything. Spain, slave traders, Sephardic Jews, slave trades. Benjamin Mordecai, the largest slave trader in South Carolina. Here's how he's going to sell people, but see how they have Elvi, Amelia, Lydia, Louisa, Patsy. These are the names he's given to the slaves. So they're going to, Sarah, they're going to end up with all these names. And then they're like, oh, it goes back to Benjamin. Look, no, Isaac. No. No, you were named by a Jewish slave trader. That book really had nothing to do with you. And guess who the Jews handed it off to?
So in South Carolina, the biggest importer of slaves and owner of slaves was a person named Joseph Ragg, who was only one of the Ragg family that brought slaves. At one point, it was thought that 1/3 of the slaves coming into South Carolina and potentially America came from Joseph Ragg.
And then made you want to hate white people. That's terrible. It's real terrible. White people have been trying to go on through this whole thing and like, yeah. I guess, man, my great-great-granddad did something wrong. We're just trying to get past it, and it just keeps getting brought up. Racism won't die, and it's because it's been riled up in the black community so bad by this. Amazing. Even the railroads, it just showed you right there, gets done. I want you to read this for yourself here, but John Wilkes Booth has something to do with it all, he finds. I'm not going to read it all out. It's really going to take too long, so I'm just going to keep pausing for you. But
Again, this is isolating a small amount of people because they want to divert attention away. And like I said, all of those groups committed those type of crimes. I don't want to just call it slavery because there was also death, torture, and all these other things. Some of it had nothing to even do with slavery. It was just for play sake.
pretty powerful. And again, kudos to this brother for finding all this information. I study ancient civilizations and try to go into it. I've looked at this somewhat, but I've never done it. And I knew about the chattel slavery until that point. But most people don't. Most people don't really know it at all, that it even took place. But here we are with these guys, the Lehman Brothers, and they kick it in, boy. Negroes, public sale, boom, boom, boom. What happens? Well, what happens is they actually start making pawn shops in cheap places for black people to sell their wares in. And what they do is they have them work. I don't know if it says it right here. They have them work for to pay off their debt, and they end up getting the next time the harvest happens what they were supposed to have gotten, and perhaps the next one after that. So they keep them double screwed off of one and keep doing it, and it's terrible. It's detestable. So let's see. In the U.S. cotton sales after the war, the Jew came down.
Now, I have to emphasize this again because some people are going to misunderstand why I'm making this video. This is not to say that the Jews have no role to play in the slave trade. They played a huge role. But again, this is where I disagreed with I forgot his name, Kahindi Andrews, where he was like, oh no, we don't deserve reparations from the Arabs because we work domestically there. It's like, I feel like you're giving a pat on the head to the Arabs. The Arabs are pretty brutal slave traders, and the Jews pretty brutal too. The Europeans pretty brutal. And again, other people obviously had slaves besides these people, but the most important is that there was this racial slave trade that occurred, which started with the Arabs, went to the Europeans, was adopted by the Jews because they were operating within the same spheres.
In force, set up shop on the plantation, supplied the Negro once on credit, and at the end of the season was the proprietor of the Negro share of the present crop and part of the next one. Before long, the whites detested the Jew and tried to run him off. And if you'll remember, there's a whole story about carpetbaggers and people coming down from the north.
So I had to do a lot of research for this. So I hope you appreciate this video. There's actually 20 minutes left, but the rest of it gets so weird that I'm almost certain the video is going to get demonetized. So I'll put that in a separate video, maybe a 10-minute video. So since he didn't mention it, I'll just put it in here. So Sao Tome and Principe virtual Jewish history tour. So Sao Tome and Principe did have some Jewish people move there, and they did merchandising over there, or really slave trade mixed with other trade, but slave trade, they participated in that as well. And this is an important part to throw in there, because the reason they went there to that area was because of the, I don't want to say use the word punish because they use it here, but let's just read it. In 1496, to punish the Jews of Portugal who would not pay the head tax of the state, the King Manuel deported nearly 2,000 Jewish children from the ages of 2 to 10 to the island of Sao Tome and Principe, straddling the equator west of Gabon. The king had wished to colonize the island under Portuguese rule, but did not want to risk the lives of Portuguese men doing so. Nevertheless, a year after the children were disposed on the island, only 600 were found alive. Some of the children attempted to retain some semblance of their Jewish heritage and religion. Even into their early 1600s, Jewish practices could still be observed on the island, but by the 18th century, most of the Jewish presence had perished. A new small community was established in 19th and 20th century with the arrival of a few Jewish coca and sugar traders. Today, there are no known practicing Jews living on the island, but there remains a clear distinction in fair-skinned citizens, many of whom can trace their ancestry back to Portuguese Jews. On July 12, 1995, an international conference was held on the island 20th Independence Day to commemorate the Jewish Portuguese children who were discarded on the island in the 15th century. Again, here we find Jewish people engaging in slavery and engaging in the general trade that occurred because of the Portuguese in Angola and Luanda. So as we read, to modern times, from the record history of the Jews in Angola stretches from the Middle Ages to modern times. From 1500s, Jewish settlers moved to Angola due to persecution in Portugal. Some historians claim that Paulo Dias de Novos, a grandson of Bartholomew Dias, was a converso. A converso, by the way, is what all of these people would have been, the ones sent to Africa. A converso means the converted. So these are people who are forced to convert to Christianity. And then because they didn't want them to stay in the Jewish regions, they sent them to Africa so that they can be isolated from the Jewish religion. Although a lot of them continued their Jewish faith secretly. And that's how some of them even ended up in Brazil and places like that. In Luanda, where a clandestine rabbi was conducting service in secret Luanda synagogue. There you go. They're conducting a secret service in secret Luanda synagogue. By the late 18th century, more Jews arrived and the community was functioning in Dondo. Now, here's the most important part. Why are they committing a secret synagogue in Luanda? It's because the majority of the white people there are not Jews. They're not conversos. They're not none of that. And then let's carry on. It says Jewish corner in the cemetery campo. This is after the 18th century. The rest of it is about what happens in recent times. So more Jews moved into that area. And again, the reason why I'm showing this is because this is the important part about it. It's not that Jews are innocent, but here's the thing. You know who ran Sao Tome and Principe? Non-Jewish Portuguese. You know who ran Luanda as a slavers bay? Non-Jewish Portuguese. The Portuguese had to survive in those areas. And I'm not saying that in a good way, but they did have to survive in those areas by pretending not to be Jewish. By the way, when I say pretending, I'm not using that as a thing. They actually did pretend. And when they didn't have to pretend, they, like when they went to Amsterdam, New Amsterdam, or wherever in the Americas, they would come out with their religion. And you read over there secret synagogues and all that stupid and all that stuff. Now, again, I don't understand why this is a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Jews participated in the slave trade. This is not an odd thing. But again, the white people who are trying to then like push themselves out and go, we had no involvement, those people are lying. They were the primary involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And then, of course, you have, the people in the Indian Ocean slave trade. Those were the Arabs with the help of Jewish people too.